Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we dive in tonight, go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soft background noise. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's joining from around the world. This one gets dark, so settle in. And if you enjoy these stories, a like really helps, but only if you genuinely want to. Alright, let's begin. November 6th, 1661. A royal birthing chamber in Madrid. The most powerful empire on earth is waiting for its heir. The midwife goes pale, steps back. Won't touch the infant. The physician makes the sign of the cross. And Queen Mariana of Austria, still bleeding from labour, looks down at what she's brought into the world and faints before anyone can catch her. The baby isn't crying like babies should. The sound coming from its malformed mouth is something else entirely. Something wrong. The infant's jaw juts out so grotesquely that his mouth can't close. His tongue hangs from his lips, too large, too thick. His head is massive, swollen, disproportionate to his tiny twisted body. His limbs are bent at angles that make the court physicians want to vomit. This is Charles II of Spain, heir to the largest empire in human history, and he is living proof that the most powerful family in Europe has been destroying itself from the inside for 200 years. Here's what makes this so much worse. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't God's punishment, or a curse, or bad luck. This baby was inevitable. The mathematical certainty of what happens when you marry your niece, who is also your cousin, whose parents were also related, going back generations in an unbroken chain of genetic catastrophe. And the Spanish Habsburgs, they did it on purpose. For 2 centuries, they chose this, every single time. They knew the children were getting sicker, weaker, stranger. They watched their own family members drool and seize and die young. And they kept doing it anyway, because keeping the bloodline pure mattered more than keeping it alive. So tonight we're going to talk about what happens when the richest, most powerful family in the world decides that marrying their own relatives is more important than basic human biology. We're going to talk about watching an empire collapse under the weight of one very bad genetic decision, repeated over and over until it created a king who couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't think, and somehow still ruled half the known world for 39 years. And here's the thing that's going to haunt you. Every step of this was documented, painted, recorded, whispered about in diplomatic letters that still exist today. We know exactly what happened. We know what they looked like. We know what they suffered. And we know they saw it coming and did nothing to stop it. Let me take you back to when the Habsburgs were gods, because you need to understand what they were before to appreciate how spectacularly they destroyed themselves. The year is 1516. Charles I inherits the Spanish throne, and he is everything his distant descendant will never be. Intelligent, physically imposing, politically brilliant. This man speaks 5 languages fluently. He's a military strategist, a patron of the arts. Under his rule, Spanish conquistadors are carving empires out of the Americas. Gold and silver pour into Spain from across the ocean. So much wealth, it literally causes inflation throughout Europe. The Spanish court sets fashion trends. Other nations copy their art, their architecture, their style. This is the dynasty that will produce Velázquez and El Greco, Cervantes and Lope de Vega. The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire because they own half the world. Charles III becomes Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He rules Spain, Austria, half of Italy, chunks of France, the Netherlands, territories in Germany, the Philippines, and basically everything worth owning in the Americas. When he speaks, other monarchs listen. When he moves his armies, nations tremble. But let me tell you something about Charles V that the history books gloss over. Even he had problems. Minor ones, nothing like what would come later, but the signs were already there if anyone had been paying attention. He suffered from severe gout so painful that he sometimes had to be carried. His jaw, the Habsburg jaw, was already present, though mild enough that it just looked like a strong facial feature. He had digestive problems his entire life. and toward the end, he showed signs of what might have been depression or early dementia. None of this stopped him from being an effective ruler, but it was the beginning, the very first cracks in the foundation. His son Philip II continues this golden age. Philip builds the Escorial Palace, this massive architectural marvel that becomes the symbol of Spanish power. Imagine a building complex so enormous it takes decades to construct, housing a palace, a monastery, a library, a museum, and royal crypts all in one. That's the kind of wealth and ambition we're talking about. Under Philip's rule, Spain's territories expand even further. The Spanish Armada, though it ultimately fails against England, represents the height of Spanish naval dominance. Philip is everything a king should be: strong, decisive, deeply Catholic, politically savvy. But Philip II's medical records, and yes, they kept detailed medical records for royalty, tell a darker story. His Habsburg jaw was more pronounced than his father's. He had chronic digestive issues that got worse with age. He suffered from fevers and infections that seemed to take longer to heal than they should. His last years were marked by agonizing pain from gout so severe he couldn't walk, and his mental state deteriorated. Toward the end, he became paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere, trusting no one. More tellingly, his children started showing serious problems. Of his multiple marriages and numerous children, most died in infancy or childhood. The ones who survived often had visible health issues. His son and heir, Philip III, was described by contemporary observers as weak in body and mind, not severely disabled, not like Charles X would be, but noticeably impaired. And here's where it really starts, the crack you don't notice at first, the one that's going to eventually shatter everything. See, the Habsburg Empire is massive but fragmented. They've got territories scattered across Europe and beyond, all of them vulnerable to being claimed by rival families through strategic marriages. One wrong alliance, one daughter married to the wrong foreign prince, and suddenly France or England or Austria has a legitimate claim to Spanish lands. So the Habsburgs come up with a solution that seems, in their minds, absolutely brilliant. Keep it in the family. Charles V marries his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son, Philip II, marries his cousin, Maria Manuela. When she dies, he marries his own niece, Mary I of England. After that ends, he marries another cousin, Elizabeth of Valois, and when she dies, he marries his niece, Anna of Austria. You notice a pattern here? At first, nobody thinks much of it. Royal intermarriage is common throughout Europe. Cousins marrying cousins is how you build alliances, how you keep land unified, how you prevent wars over succession. Every royal family does it to some degree. But the Habsburgs take it further. They don't just marry cousins occasionally. They marry exclusively within an increasingly small pool of relatives. Uncle to niece, first cousins, second cousins, who are also related through 3 other family lines. And here's what makes it exponentially worse. It's not just one generation making this choice, it's generation after generation, compounding the genetic damage. Every child born from these unions carries 2 copies of damaged genes, one from each parent who shares the same ancestors. And then those children marry more relatives, passing on 4 copies of the damaged genes. Then 8, then 16. The genetic damage multiplies like a mathematical equation spiraling toward disaster. Their family tree stops branching. It starts knotting in on itself, looping back, tangling, and with each generation, something starts appearing in the portraits. Something the artists try to make look distinguished and noble, but is actually the first visible sign of genetic breakdown. The jaw, you've probably seen it, that distinctive Habsburg look. In the early portraits it's subtle, a strong jawline, aristocratic even. Philip II has it. You barely notice. His jaw is just a bit prominent, a bit square. It actually looks kind of regal in the paintings. Court artists know how to work with it, painting him at angles that make it look intentional, powerful even. His son Philip III has it worse. There are records of him having difficulty eating certain foods, though the court physicians don't understand why. They attribute it to weak digestion or bad humours. They try treating him with special diets, with herbs, with bloodletting. Nothing helps because the problem isn't medical. It's structural. His jaw doesn't align properly with the rest of his skull. The portraits still make him look handsome, but foreign ambassadors who meet him in person start mentioning his unusual appearance in their private letters home. One Venetian ambassador wrote that Philip III had a face that would benefit from being viewed from a distance. Another noted that the king speaks as if his mouth is full of cloth. These weren't insults meant for public consumption. These were private diplomatic reports, honest assessments sent back to their home governments. Philip IV, Charles II's father, has it severely. His lower jaw juts forward, creating an underbite so pronounced that his teeth don't align properly. He has trouble chewing meat. He speaks with a slight impediment that makes some words almost unintelligible. He drools when he eats, requiring servants to constantly wipe his chin during meals. This is humiliating for a man who's supposed to be the most powerful monarch in Europe. The court artists, because yes, they essentially were court artists, just with paint, have to work increasingly hard to make him look normal. They paint him in profile. They soften the jaw in the image. They surround him with elaborate clothing and jewellery to distract from his face. They use shadows strategically. Some portraits are so heavily idealised they barely resemble the actual man. But here's what the portraits absolutely cannot show you. The drooling. The chronic jaw pain that kept Philip IV awake at night. The infections in his mouth from teeth that don't fit together properly, creating pockets where food would rot. The constant headaches from the skull malformation, putting pressure on nerves. The difficulty swallowing that meant he had to eat soft foods and drink excessively just to get meals down. The embarrassment of conducting state business while drooling into a cloth. Foreign ambassadors who had audiences with Philip IV wrote shocked reports. One English diplomat described watching the King of Spain conduct a meeting while a servant stood behind him, periodically reaching around to wipe the king's chin. The diplomat noted that Philip seemed unaware this was even happening. It had become so routine that he'd stopped noticing. This is mandibular prognathism, a recessive genetic trait that shows up when both parents carry the gene. And when you're marrying your relatives over and over, the chances of both parents carrying the same recessive genes increases exponentially with each generation. The jaw is just what you can see. It's the visible manifestation of something much worse happening at the genetic level. Because inbreeding doesn't just affect one trait, it affects everything, every system, every organ, every developmental process. Think about it this way. You inherit one set of genes from your mother and one from your father. If there's a genetic mutation, a mistake in the code, having two different versions means the healthy gene can usually compensate for the broken one. But when your parents are closely related, you're getting the same versions of genes from both sides, including the broken ones. And with no healthy backup copy, those broken genes express themselves. With mild inbreeding, you might get minor problems, a weak chin, a tendency towards certain illnesses, but the Habsburgs weren't doing mild inbreeding. They were doing it intensively, repeatedly, for generations. Each generation inherited more broken genes, with no healthy copies to compensate. The damage accumulated like interest on a loan you never pay off. And by the time we get to Charles II's parents, the genetic damage is catastrophic. So let's talk about Philip IV's marriage to Mariana of Austria, because this is where the nightmare really begins, where all those generations of accumulated genetic damage come to a head in one perfectly disastrous union. Philip is in his 40s when his first wife, Elizabeth of France, dies. He needs a male heir desperately. His existing children are either daughters, who can't inherit the throne under Spanish law, or sickly sons who won't survive childhood. The pressure on Philip is immense. The entire Spanish Empire, the fate of millions of people, The continuation of Habsburg dominance, all of it depends on him producing a healthy male heir. So he arranges a marriage with Mariana of Austria, who is his niece. Let me make this absolutely clear because it's important to understand just how genetically close these two people were. Mariana's mother, Maria Anna of Spain, was Philip's sister, his own sister. This isn't a distant cousin situation. This isn't a second cousin twice removed. This is a man marrying his brother-in-law's daughter, his own sister's child. Mariana's father was Ferdinand III, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was himself the product of Habsburg inbreeding. Ferdinand's parents were first cousins, so Mariana was already carrying a significant genetic burden before her marriage even began. When Philip proposed marriage to his 15-year-old niece, some members of the court expressed concerns, not about genetics, they didn't have that framework yet, but about the optics, about the spiritual implications, about whether this was pushing the boundaries of what even the Catholic Church would allow. The Pope had to give special dispensation for the marriage to proceed. The church officials who granted it wrote lengthy theological justifications about how this union served God's will by preserving Catholic Habsburg rule. Reading those documents now, knowing what we know about genetics, is darkly ironic. They were essentially blessing a genetic catastrophe in the name of God. And Mariana, she's 15 years old. She has no say in this marriage. She's been raised knowing that her purpose is to serve the family, to produce heirs to be politically useful. When she's told she'll marry her uncle, 30 years her senior, she accepts it because that's what Habsburg women do. But the letters she wrote to her mother in the years before the wedding reveal a girl who was terrified, who didn't want to leave Austria, who begged to be allowed to stay home. She was ignored. Political necessity overrode everything else. The wedding took place in 1649. Mariana travelled from Vienna to Madrid, a journey of several weeks, knowing she was heading toward a marriage that everyone understood was more political contract than romantic union. The wedding ceremony was elaborate, as Habsburg weddings always were. Mariana was dressed in layers of silk and jewels. Philip wore his finest clothes, carefully tailored to disguise his increasing physical problems. Contemporary accounts describe Mariana as pale during the ceremony, trembling, barely able to speak her vows. One observer noted that she looked more like she was attending a funeral than a wedding. Philip, for his part, seemed impatient, eager to get through the ceremony and secure the heir he so desperately needed. The age gap is unsettling, but that's not even the worst part. The worst part is the genetics. Modern geneticists have analysed the Habsburg family tree. It's remarkably well documented because royal lineages were considered important, and they've calculated that Philip and Mariana's marriage was so genetically close that it's equivalent to a parent-child union in terms of shared DNA. Let me say that again. The King of Spain married someone so closely related to him that, genetically speaking, they might as well have been father and daughter. Their coefficient of relationship, the measure of how much DNA they share, was approximately 0.25. That's the same as what you'd see between a parent and child, or between full siblings. Under modern laws in virtually every country, this marriage would be not just illegal, but criminal. Their children never stood a chance. Mariana's first pregnancy, in 1650, was difficult from the start. She suffered severe morning sickness that lasted the entire pregnancy. Court physicians were concerned but attributed it to her young age and inexperience. She gave birth to a daughter who was stillborn. The child was described in medical records as malformed, though details were kept secret. Mariana nearly died from blood loss, an infection following the birth. Before she'd even fully recovered, the pressure was back on. She needed to get pregnant again, needed to produce the male heir. Her body wasn't ready. She was 16 years old, traumatized, still healing. But Philip needed an heir, so within months she was pregnant again. The second pregnancy ended in miscarriage at 5 months. The fetus was described as not fully formed. Mariana's physical and emotional state was deteriorating. She was 17 years old and had already endured a stillbirth and a miscarriage, each one taking a massive toll on her young body. The third pregnancy produced another stillborn daughter. This one had survived longer, was full term, but died during birth. Medical records describe the infant as having severe deformities, a grotesquely large head, malformed limbs, and what might have been spina bifida or another neural tube defect. Mariana was 19 and had been pregnant 3 times. She had 0 living children. She was emotionally shattered, physically exhausted, and still the pressure continued because the empire needed a male heir. The 4th pregnancy, in 1657, finally produced a living son, Philip Prospero, and the entire Spanish court erupted in celebration, like he was the second coming of Christ. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered in every church in Spain. Bells rang across Madrid for 3 days straight. Portraits were commissioned immediately. Coins were minted with the prince's image. Official announcements were sent to every European court, proclaiming the birth of the Spanish heir. Philip Prospero was dressed in elaborate gowns in his portraits, as was the custom for noble children of that era. He's painted with dogs and toys, symbols of a healthy, happy childhood. The artists were instructed to make him look robust, thriving, perfect. But look closely at these paintings if you ever see them in person. Really look. The child's face is pale, almost translucent. His eyes are vacant, staring at nothing. He's thin in an unhealthy way. Not the slender grace of childhood, but the wasting of chronic illness. And around his waist, barely visible in some paintings but prominent in others, he wears amulets and charms meant to ward off evil and illness. Because Philip Prospero was sick from the day he was born. Constantly, desperately sick. He couldn't eat properly. He vomited frequently. He had seizures that terrified his caregivers. Fevers that would spike suddenly, leaving him convulsing and unresponsive for hours. He was weak, unable to play like normal children, unable to even sit up for long periods without becoming exhausted. Court physicians attended him around the clock, trying every medieval remedy they could think of. Bloodletting to balance his humours, though this only made him weaker. Leeches applied to his small body to draw out bad blood. Prayers and holy water. Relics brought from churches across Spain. Scraps of saints' clothing, fragments of holy bones, vials of sacred oil. They tried special diets, herbal concoctions, astrological timing of treatments based on the positions of planets. Nothing worked. Nothing could work. Philip Prospero was dying from the moment he was conceived. Foreign ambassadors who managed to see the prince sent worried reports home. One wrote that the heir to Spain looked more like a walking corpse than a living child. Another described him as a pitiable creature, clearly not long for this world, though none dare say it aloud. The Spanish court existed in a state of collective denial. Everyone could see Philip Prospero was dying, but saying it out loud was unthinkable, so they maintained the fiction. Official updates about the prince's health were always positive. He's feeling better. He's growing stronger. He ate a full meal today. He played for an hour. All lies or massive exaggerations meant to reassure the Spanish people and foreign powers that the succession was secure. Philip Prospero died in 1661, just a few days before his 4th birthday. The official cause was listed as a fever, but that was meaningless. He died from everything. From genetic diseases that didn't have names yet, from a body that was never viable, from being the product of 2 centuries of inbreeding concentrated into one small, fragile life. His death sent Queen Mariana into a breakdown. She was 23 years old. She'd been married for 12 years. She'd been pregnant 5 times. She had buried 3 stillborn daughters and watched her only living son die slowly over 4 years. Her body was wrecked from multiple pregnancies and traumatic births. Her mind was fracturing under the weight of grief and guilt. and the Spanish Empire still needed a male heir. The succession still depended on her ability to produce a healthy son. The pressure from Philip, from the court, from the entire political structure of Spain was relentless and crushing. So Mariana got pregnant again, and from the very beginning, this pregnancy was different. Wrong. She was sick in ways she wasn't with her previous pregnancies. The morning sickness didn't stop. It continued through the entire 9 months. She couldn't keep food down. She lost weight even as her belly grew. She was weak, dizzy, constantly in pain. Her body seemed to be rejecting the child she was carrying. Like on some cellular level, it knew what was growing inside her wasn't viable. The court physicians were baffled. They'd never seen anything like this. In their medieval understanding of medicine, pregnancy sickness usually resolved after the first few months. This didn't. If anything, it got worse. They bled her thinking it would balance her humours. They gave her herbs, ginger, mint, various concoctions. They prayed over her. They brought holy relics to her bedside. Queen Mariana prayed too, constantly, desperately, begging God for a healthy son. She visited holy relics, despite being barely able to stand. She made pilgrimages to churches. She promised donations, acts of charity, anything and everything, if God would just let this child be normal. She kept a journal during this pregnancy, and fragments of it still exist in Spanish archives. The entries are heartbreaking. "I feel that something is wrong," she wrote. "This child moves differently. My body rejects it. I am afraid." Another entry. "The physicians assure me all is well, but I know it is not. I can feel it. This pregnancy will not end as I hope." Mariana wasn't stupid. She'd already buried multiple children. She'd watched Philip Prospero die by inches. She knew something was wrong with the Habsburg line, even if she didn't have the language or framework to understand. It was genetic. She just knew that something in her family, in her blood, was broken. And she was right. But here's what she didn't know. What nobody in 1661 could possibly know. The child in her womb had already lost the genetic lottery in the most catastrophic way possible. Charles II's coefficient of inbreeding is 254. Let me put that in context for you. The coefficient of inbreeding measures how much genetic material is identical by descent, how much of your DNA comes from shared ancestors on both your mother's and father's side. A completely unrelated couple would have a coefficient of 0. First cousins marrying would produce children with a coefficient of about 0.625. Brother and sister would produce 0.25. Charles II's coefficient was 254, higher than a brother-sister union. That's not hyperbole. That's the actual calculated number based on genealogical analysis of his family tree. To give you even more context, laboratory mice bred intentionally for genetic research have coefficients around 0.25. Charles exceeded that. The heir to the Spanish Empire was more inbred than lab animals specifically bred to be genetically uniform for experiments. Every human has about 20,000 or 25,000 genes. Each gene has 2 copies, one from mum, one from dad. This redundancy is protective. If you inherit a mutated gene from one parent, the healthy copy from the other parent usually compensates. This is why most genetic diseases are recessive. You need 2 broken copies for the disease to manifest, but when your parents are closely related, you inherit the same versions of genes from both sides, including all the broken ones. Charles inherited matching broken genes from both parents for potentially thousands of genes. His body was trying to develop using genetic instructions that were corrupted, incomplete, or outright contradictory. The jaw malformation was caused by mutations in genes controlling cranial bone development. The cognitive impairment came from genes affecting brain development. The immune problems, the hormonal issues, the organ malformations, all resulted from inheriting double copies of damaged genes with no healthy backup. And somewhere in Queen Mariana's womb, as the fetus developed through those 9 months, things were going catastrophically wrong. The jaw began growing too large, too fast. The brain didn't form properly. Neurological structures that should have connected didn't. Organs developed abnormally. The heart was too small. The digestive system malformed. The skeletal system didn't align correctly. The endocrine system, which regulates hormones and growth, was fundamentally broken. By month 5, when most fetuses are viable enough to survive if born prematurely, Charles was already damaged beyond repair. By month 7, Mariana's body was in crisis, trying to sustain a fetus that was demanding resources it couldn't properly use, that was growing in ways that created physical danger for both mother and child. The pregnancy went to full term though. Mariana carried Charles for 9 full months, and every day of it was agony. Physical pain from a pregnancy gone wrong, emotional terror because she knew something was very wrong, spiritual anguish because she believed this was somehow her fault or God's punishment. By the time Mariana went into labour on November 6, 1661, her body had been carrying this genetic disaster for 9 months. The labour itself was horrific. It started in the morning and continued for over 12 hours. 12 hours of increasingly intense contractions. 12 hours of Mariana screaming that something was wrong, that this was different from her previous births, that she could feel that the child was wrong. The royal birthing chamber was crowded with people, as was customary for royal births. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting, midwives, physicians, court officials who needed to witness the birth to verify its legitimacy. Religious officials to perform immediate baptism, if necessary, all these people standing around while Mariana suffered on the birthing bed. As the hours passed, the mood in the room grew increasingly tense. The labour was taking too long. Mariana was bleeding more than she should. The baby wasn't positioning correctly for birth. Medieval medicine had limited options for dealing with difficult births. The physicians tried to manually reposition the baby, causing Mariana additional agony. They gave her wine mixed with herbs to strengthen her. They prayed. Contemporary accounts describe Mariana becoming increasingly hysterical as the labour progressed. She kept saying something was wrong with the child. She could feel it. She knew. The physicians tried to calm her, telling her that all births were difficult, that she would feel better once the child arrived. But Mariana wasn't calmed. She was terrified because her body was telling her something everyone else was refusing to acknowledge. When the baby finally emerged, after 12 hours of labour, there was a moment of complete silence. One of the midwives, an experienced woman who had delivered dozens of royal and noble babies, backed away from the birthing bed. Her hand went to her mouth. Her face went white. A physician who had moved forward to receive the infant stopped mid-motion. He made the sign of the cross. A court official who was supposed to be documenting the birth time and appearance started praying under his breath. The infant's head was grotesquely oversized, not just large, malformed. The skull was misshapen, elongated, with fontanelles that were far too large. His face was a disaster. The jaw jutted out so far that his mouth hung open, unable to close. Inside that gaping mouth, they could see his tongue, swollen, oversized, protruding. His eyes were set too far apart, giving his face an alien appearance. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over abnormal bone structure. His limbs were thin and twisted, his arms bent at wrong angles. His legs were malformed, the bones not quite straight, the feet turned inward. His torso was small, disproportionate to his massive head, and he was making sounds. Not the healthy cries of a newborn. These were wet, gurgling noises that came from deep in his malformed throat. Bubbling sounds as fluid moved in airways that weren't properly formed. Choking sounds as his overlarge tongue blocked his airway. One of the midwives began crying silently. Mariana, still on the birthing bed, still in pain, still bleeding, lifted her head to see her son. She looked at him, this thing she'd carried for 9 months, this child she'd prayed would be healthy, this heir that Spain desperately needed. She looked at him for maybe 5 seconds, Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened. She tried to say something, but no words came out, and then her eyes rolled back and she fainted. When they revived her, she refused to hold the baby. She turned her face away when they tried to bring him close. She started crying, deep racking sobs that shook her whole body. The physicians were worried she was hemorrhaging, but the blood loss was within normal range. This was psychological trauma, not physical. But eventually, hours later, when she'd been cleaned and moved to her recovery bed, they brought Charles to her again. This time she looked at him. Really looked, and something in her broke permanently. Because this was her son, her child, and he was a monster. Not through any fault of his own, but because of what she and Philip had done. Because of generations of Habsburg marriages that had led inevitably to this moment. Because of choices made long before she was born that had culminated in this tragedy. She held him finally, this small broken thing, and she cried over him. Not tears of joy, tears of grief and horror and guilt and pity, because she knew what she'd brought into the world. She knew what this meant for Spain, for the dynasty, for this poor child who would have to live in this broken body. Later, she would tell her confessor that she prayed that night for God to take Charles, to let him die quickly, mercifully, rather than live a life of suffering. To spare him what she knew was coming, but Charles didn't die. Against all odds, against all reason, his damaged body clung to life, and the Spanish Empire was stuck with him. The court officials moved immediately into damage control mode. Information about the prince's condition became classified as the highest state secret. Only the most trusted servants, the most loyal courtiers, were allowed near him. Everyone who entered the royal nursery was sworn to secrecy under pain of death. Official announcements about the birth were carefully worded. A son has been born to their majesties. The prince is small but spirited. The royal family requests prayers for the health and strength of the heir. No details, no descriptions, nothing that might reveal the truth. Portraits were commissioned immediately, as was customary for royal births, but the artists were given very specific instructions. Make him look normal. The portraits that resulted bore no resemblance to reality. They depicted a healthy, normal-looking infant. Plump cheeks, proportionate features, eyes that focused. These paintings were distributed to courts across Europe as proof that Spain had a viable heir. Meanwhile, the real Charles, hidden away in the royal apartments, was barely surviving his first weeks of life. Feeding was a nightmare from the start. He couldn't nurse. His malformed jaw and palate made latching onto a breast impossible. His tongue was too large, blocking his mouth. When they tried to feed him with a wet nurse, milk would run back out of his mouth. He would choke, gag, turn blue from lack of oxygen. The court physicians and midwives had to develop special feeding apparatus. Medieval bottles, essentially. Carved wooden spouts that could bypass his malformed mouth and deliver liquid nutrition directly toward his throat. Even then, feeding sessions took hours. Charles would choke repeatedly. Milk would go into his lungs, causing infections. He had to be held at specific angles to prevent him from aspirating, and he was always hungry because they couldn't get enough nutrition into him. This tiny infant, already damaged, was also malnourished from birth because his body couldn't perform the basic function of eating. He didn't develop like normal infants. Pediatric developmental milestones, the markers that doctors use to assess infant health, were completely absent. At 2 months, when babies typically start holding their heads up and tracking objects with their eyes, Charles's neck couldn't support his oversized skull. His head would loll to one side unless someone held it straight. His eyes didn't focus or track. They stared, vacant, at nothing. At 4 months, when babies start reaching for objects and responding to sounds, Charles showed no sign of awareness. He didn't reach. He didn't respond to voices or loud noises. He didn't smile or make eye contact. He just lay there, making those awful gurgling sounds, existing but not really living. Queen Mariana spent every waking hour with him. She was determined to be a good mother despite her horror at his condition. She would sit with him for hours, holding his head straight, moving his limbs gently, trying to encourage some kind of muscle development. She would talk to him constantly, reading aloud, singing, telling stories, hoping for any sign that he could hear her, understand her, connect with her. Her ladies-in-waiting watched her slow deterioration. This young woman, she was only 23, aging rapidly under the weight of grief and guilt, and desperate, futile hope. Her hair started going grey. Lines appeared on her face. She stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping well. She was wasting away almost, as much as her son. The court physicians were completely out of their depth. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding genetic disorders, developmental disabilities, or the complex medical needs of a child like Charles. They understood broken bones, fevers, wounds. They didn't understand why a baby's body would simply not work correctly from birth. They tried their standard remedies anyway. Bloodletting, which only made Charles weaker and more lethargic. Leeches applied to his tiny body to draw out bad blood. Various herbal concoctions meant to strengthen him. None of it helped because none of it could. Charles's problems weren't medical in the sense they understood. They were fundamental, written into every cell of his body. Religious authorities were brought in. Exorcisms were performed over the infant prince because some believed his condition might be demonic possession. Priests prayed over him for hours. Holy water was sprinkled on him. Relics were brought from churches across Spain. Fragments of saints' bones, scraps of holy cloth, vials of sacred oil. Charles was anointed, blessed, prayed over by the most powerful religious figures in Spain. Nothing changed, because this wasn't demons, this was DNA. When Charles was 6 months old, an age when babies are typically rolling over, sitting with support, babbling, engaging with the world, he remained essentially unchanged from birth. He still couldn't hold his head up. He still couldn't eat properly. He still showed no signs of awareness or development. His eyes were vacant. His body was limp, but he was alive. Against all medical knowledge, against all expectations, this baby whose body should not have been viable continued to breathe, continued to exist. King Philip IV, now in his 50s and in declining health himself, visited his son and heir with increasing dread mixed with something like disbelief. Philip had spent his entire adult life wielding power, commanding armies, ruling an empire that spanned the globe. He was accustomed to his will being done, to problems being solved, to obstacles being overcome through force or cunning or wealth. And now his legacy, the future of everything he'd built, rested in this infant who couldn't even hold his own head up. This child who would never be able to rule, who might not even survive infancy, who represented the complete failure of the Habsburg dynasty. But Philip couldn't acknowledge this publicly. He couldn't admit that his heir was damaged beyond repair, so he participated in the fiction. He commissioned more portraits showing a healthy prince. He issued proclamations about Charles's strength and promise. He made plans for Charles's future education, his future marriage, his future coronation, all pretending that the child would somehow miraculously recover. In private, though, Philip knew. The letters he wrote to his closest advisors, preserved in archives, show a man in despair. He wrote about feeling cursed, about wondering what sins the Habsburg line had committed to deserve this, about the bitter irony of ruling the largest empire on earth while watching his legacy literally drool and gurgle in a nursery, unable to even recognise his own father. Philip's own health was failing rapidly, his genetic burden manifesting in chronic illnesses and premature aging. He had gout so severe he could barely walk, digestive problems that left him in constant pain, possible mini-strokes that affected his memory and cognition. He was dying, and he knew he was leaving his empire to this. As Charles approached his first birthday, a milestone worth celebrating for any infant, a miracle for one in his condition, the court prepared elaborate ceremonies. A first birthday feast was planned, religious services of thanksgiving, official celebrations throughout Spain. But privately, everyone who saw Charles knew the truth. This was not a healthy heir growing strong. This was a damaged child, growing larger but not developing, existing but not truly living. The celebrations felt hollow, forced, a collective pretense that everyone was required to maintain, but no one actually believed. Foreign ambassadors started reporting more accurate information back to their governments. The initial stories that Spain had a healthy heir were being quietly corrected. Reports now described the prince as delicate or troubled by ill health, or more honestly, severely afflicted and unlikely to survive to adulthood. European courts began making contingency plans for Spanish succession, recognizing that Charles probably wouldn't live long enough to rule and certainly wouldn't produce heirs of his own. The pressure this put on Queen Mariana was immense. She was simultaneously caring for a severely disabled infant, grieving the healthy child she'd never have, managing court politics, and facing the reality that Spain's succession crisis was far from resolved. She was 24 years old. Most women her age were enjoying their young children, perhaps pregnant with a second or third. Mariana was in a living nightmare with no escape. And then, when Charles was 4 years old, King Philip IV died. The king's death in 1665 was not unexpected. He'd been ill for years, but it was still catastrophic for Spain. The nation lost its monarch, and the heir who should have brought stability and continuity was a 4-year-old child who couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't feed himself, couldn't function in any meaningful way. Charles II became King of Spain at age 4, a child who had the developmental capacity of an infant, a child who needed to be carried everywhere, who needed to be fed with special apparatus, who made wet gurgling sounds instead of words. This child was now the absolute monarch of the largest empire on earth, ruling over territories spanning Europe, the Americas, the Philippines, and various colonial outposts scattered around the globe. The constitutional crisis this created was unprecedented. How do you govern an empire when your absolute monarch is absolutely incapable? How do you make decisions that require the king's approval when the king can't understand questions, let alone provide answers? How do you maintain the mystique of divine kingship when the king is obviously not blessed by God? A regency was established with Queen Mariana as regent. At 27 years old, she became the effective ruler of Spain. She was smart, politically savvy, and deeply committed to preserving her son's throne and the Habsburg dynasty. But she was also a woman in a 17th century world that fundamentally did not believe women should wield power. Every decision she made was questioned. Every policy she implemented was opposed by noble factions who saw Charles's incompetence as an opportunity to grab power for themselves. The Spanish court became a snake pit of competing interests, all maneuvering for influence and control while maintaining the fiction that they were serving the king. The coronation of Charles II had to happen. It was required by Spanish law and tradition to legitimize his rule. But how do you crown a king who can't stand on his own? The ceremony took months to plan, not because of elaborate pageantry, but because court officials had to figure out the logistics of crowning a child who was essentially a living prop. Every aspect had to be carefully choreographed to hide Charles's disabilities while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. The crown itself had to be specially modified. The traditional crown of Spain was heavy gold, encrusted with jewels, designed to sit on the head of a grown man. It was far too heavy for Charles's weak neck and abnormally shaped skull. The weight alone might cause him to collapse or injure him. Goldsmiths worked for weeks creating a lighter version. They used thin gold plating instead of solid gold. They replaced some of the heavier jewels with lighter alternatives or removed them entirely. Even then, during the ceremony, the crown could only be placed on Charles's head for brief moments. Servants had to stand close enough to catch it. if it started sliding off his misshapen skull. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of deception and theatre. Charles had to be literally positioned like a doll through every stage. Servants dressed in elaborate costumes stood close on all sides, ostensibly for ceremony, but actually to physically hold him upright when needed. When Charles had to walk, he was essentially carried while his feet made minimal contact with the ground, creating the illusion of walking. When he had to sit on the throne, special supports were hidden behind elaborate fabric to hold him in position. When he had to hold the royal scepter, a servant's hand was underneath his, actually gripping the scepter, while Charles's hand was merely placed on top. The oaths that every Spanish king had to speak, sacred promises to defend the Catholic faith, protect the realm, uphold justice, were impossible for Charles. He couldn't speak. He could barely make sounds. So the court developed an elaborate workaround that was equal parts ingenious and horrifying. The officiating archbishop would ask each question. Charles would make sounds, any sounds, whatever guttural noises came from his malformed throat, and the archbishop would interpret these noises as words, as agreement, as the solemn oaths of a king. Do you, Charles II, swear before God to defend the Holy Catholic faith? Charles, wet, gurgling sound. Archbishop, the king has sworn. Do you promise to protect the Kingdom of Spain and all its territories? Charles, choking noise. Archbishop, the king has given his sacred oath. It was madness. Everyone present knew it was madness, but it was legally necessary madness, and so it proceeded. Foreign ambassadors who attended wrote shocked, detailed reports back to their home countries. The French ambassador described watching a grotesque puppet show where a clearly incompetent child was manipulated through a ceremony he could not possibly understand. The English representative wrote that Charles appeared more animal than human, guided through the ritual as one might lead a trained dog with as much comprehension. The Venetian ambassador was more blunt. Spain has crowned a monster who can neither speak nor stand, and they expect the world to bow to him as king. It is a farce that would be comedic were it not so tragic. But these reports, while circulated privately among European courts, were not made public. Diplomatic protocol required maintaining the fiction. Foreign governments continued to treat Charles II as the legitimate King of Spain, sending ambassadors to his court, negotiating treaties in his name, even though everyone involved knew the truth. The coronation feast that followed was even more disturbing than the ceremony itself. Charles was seated at the head of a massive table loaded with elaborate dishes, roasted meats, exotic fruits, elaborate pastries, all the finest foods the Spanish Empire could provide. He couldn't eat any of it. Servants had to feed him liquid mush with a spoon, while nobles and dignitaries from across Europe sat nearby, pretending not to notice the king drooling down his elaborate coronation robes. Charles wore a bib, essentially, hidden beneath ornate fabric to catch the constant drool. But it wasn't entirely effective, and wet spots appeared on his clothing throughout the meal. Several times during the feast, Charles became agitated. Whether from discomfort, confusion, or pain, he would start making those horrible keening sounds. Not quite screams, but high-pitched vocalizations that echoed through the great hall. When this happened, court musicians would immediately begin playing loudly to cover the noise. Courtiers would suddenly engage in loud, animated conversations. Anything to pretend this was normal, this was fine, this was acceptable. One guest later wrote about watching servants wipe Charles's chin while he made the most distressing sounds I have ever heard from a human throat. Another described the king becoming so agitated that he had to be briefly removed from the feast, carried away like a misbehaving toddler while the remaining guests pretended nothing had happened. But the ceremony was complete. Charles II was now officially King of Spain. The coronation couldn't be undone. The oaths had been spoken, interpreted, manipulated, but technically spoken. Spain now had a king who couldn't walk, talk, or eat solid food. And the empire began its terminal decline. Queen Mariana, as regent, found herself fighting a war on multiple fronts. She had to actually govern an empire that was already under strain. She had to manage court politics and competing noble factions. She had to maintain the fiction of Charles's competence. And she had to care for her son, who required constant medical attention and supervision. The governmental system that had efficiently run a global empire began breaking down immediately. Decision-making became a nightmare. Officially, all major decisions required the king's approval. But how do you get approval from someone who can't understand questions? The court developed elaborate workarounds. Documents would be read aloud to Charles. He would make sounds. Court officials would interpret these sounds as agreement or disagreement based on what they had already decided was the right course of action. It was government by ventriloquism, with Charles as an unwitting puppet. This created massive opportunities for corruption. Nobles who had access to Charles could claim he had approved their pet projects or policies. Courtiers fought for positions close to the king, not because Charles himself had any power, but because proximity allowed them to manipulate what decisions were supposedly approved by royal authority. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned that the real power was with Queen Mariana and her advisors, not with Charles. Diplomacy became a delicate dance of officially presenting credentials to the king, which meant standing in a room while Charles drooled and made noises, then conducting actual negotiations with the Regency Council. Military command suffered immediately. Spain was engaged in multiple conflicts across Europe. The War of Devolution against France, rebellions in Sicily and Naples, ongoing conflicts in the Netherlands. These required strategic decision-making, rapid responses to changing battlefield conditions, coordination across vast distances. But the commander-in-chief was a 5-year-old child who couldn't understand what war was. Orders went out in the king's name, but they were delayed by the need to maintain the fiction of royal approval. By the time military commanders received instructions, battlefield conditions had changed. Spanish forces began losing engagements. They should have won, not because of inferior troops or tactics, but because of the chaos in command structure. Foreign powers recognized Spain's weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. French forces under Louis XIV carved chunks out of the Spanish Netherlands. Local governors in Spanish territories started acting independently, recognizing that Madrid was in no position to enforce its authority. The mighty Spanish Empire was coming apart because the centre couldn't hold, and the centre was a drooling child king. The economic consequences were equally catastrophic. The Spanish economy was already strained from decades of warfare and inflation. The massive influx of silver and gold from the Americas had actually hurt Spain's economy by causing runaway inflation. Spanish manufactured goods couldn't compete with cheaper products from other European nations. The economy needed careful management, strategic reforms, decisive action. Instead, it got chaos. Trade policies went unenforced because there was no effective central authority to implement them. Tax collection became increasingly corrupt as local officials realized Madrid was too dysfunctional to audit them carefully. Colonial governors in the Americas started skimming larger and larger shares of silver shipments, knowing the confusion in Madrid made discovery unlikely. The Spanish currency was debased repeatedly. The government, desperate for funds to fight wars and suppress rebellions, melted down coins and reminted them with less precious metal content. This only made inflation worse. Food prices soared. The common people, who had once been proud subjects of the mighty Spanish Empire, were now starving and angry. Bread riots broke out in Madrid itself in 1666, just a year after Charles's coronation. Hungry crowds gathered outside the royal palace, demanding food, demanding action, demanding that their king do something to help them. Charles, of course, had no idea this was happening. He was in his apartments, being fed his liquid mush, existing in his own small world of immediate physical needs and discomforts. The empire could burn around him, and he would never know. The riots were suppressed by force, but the message was clear. Spain's people were losing faith in the monarchy. The mystique that had sustained Habsburg rule was crumbling under the weight of obvious royal incompetence. And through all of this, Charles just continued existing. Not growing, not developing, just persisting. His body survived despite having every reason not to. He was a living reminder of what happens when political ambition overrides biological reality, when keeping power concentrated becomes more important than the health of actual human beings. But his childhood was only beginning. The full horror of Charles II's life was yet to unfold, and Spain would spend decades watching its empire collapse while ruled by a king who couldn't understand that he was a king, let alone what that meant. The years that followed would be a slow-motion catastrophe, each one worse than the last, as Charles failed to improve and Spain failed to recover. The story was far from over. If anything, the worst was still to come. The Spanish court refused to accept reality. Charles was 6, 7, 8 years old and still couldn't walk independently or speak. But the fiction had to be maintained that he was developing normally, just slowly, so they tried to educate him. The tutors brought in to teach the king were among the finest minds in Spain. Scholars, linguists, mathematicians, men who had successfully educated dozens of noble children. They arrived at court with confidence and left broken. Teaching Charles to read was impossible. He couldn't focus his eyes on text, couldn't hold a book, couldn't sit still for more than a few minutes before becoming agitated. The tutors would try to guide his hand across pages, pointing at letters, but there was no recognition, no understanding. His eyes would stare at the page without seeing. They tried teaching him to write. Again, impossible. His hands lacked the fine motor control to hold a quill. When they tried to guide his hand to form letters, the results were random scrawls. No muscle memory developed. No improvement over months and years of daily practice. Mathematics, completely hopeless. Charles couldn't grasp the concept of numbers, couldn't count. One tutor spent 6 months trying to teach him to recognize the difference between one object and two objects. Charles never learned it. Language instruction was perhaps most heartbreaking. The tutors would speak to him constantly in Spanish, slowly and clearly. They would point at objects and name them. Cup, table, dog. They would repeat words thousands of times. Ball, ball, ball. Can you say ball, Your Majesty? Charles would make sounds, but never the right sounds. Never anything approaching actual words. Just those same wet, guttural noises he'd been making since birth. And yet the official reports to the Regency Council were always optimistic. The king is making progress. His studies continue. He shows interest in his lessons. All lies, but necessary lies to maintain the fiction. Foreign ambassadors who asked about the king's education were told he was studying diligently, that he showed particular aptitude for religious studies, that his tutors were pleased with his development. Meanwhile, those same tutors were writing private letters to friends and family, describing their assignments as torture, as impossible tasks that slowly drove them mad. One tutor lasted only 3 months before requesting reassignment. He wrote in his journal, later discovered, that trying to teach Charles was like attempting to teach a stone to speak, or a corpse to dance. There is nothing there to teach. The boy is an empty vessel that cannot be filled. Another tutor, more patient or more desperate for the prestigious royal appointment, lasted 2 years. His reports show a man slowly losing hope. Early entries describe creative teaching methods he's trying. Later entries become shorter, more resigned. The final entry, written the day before he quit, reads simply, "I have failed. God forgive me, I have failed." But the lessons continued because stopping them would mean acknowledging the truth. So new tutors were brought in, given the same impossible task, and watched as they, too, realised the heir to Spain was ineducable. Physical development was equally dismal. Charles finally achieved something resembling walking at age 8, but it was a stumbling, lurching gait that required constant supervision. His legs were weak, his balance non-existent. He would take a few steps and collapse. Servants had to stay within arm's reach at all times to catch him. Court doctors tried various treatments to strengthen him. Special exercises where they would move his limbs for him, trying to build muscle. Special diets rich in meat and milk, though Charles could still only consume soft foods and liquids. Nothing worked. His body remained weak, underdeveloped, barely functional. And as Charles entered his teenage years, puberty brought new horrors. His already severe physical problems were compounded by hormonal changes his broken body couldn't properly process. His jaw, already grotesquely large, somehow became even more pronounced. The lower mandible jutted out so far that there was a gap of several inches between his upper and lower teeth. He couldn't close his mouth at all. His tongue lolled out constantly. The drool that had always been a problem became a torrent. He needed cloths changed every few minutes. His teeth, never properly aligned, began rotting. Without the ability to chew or properly clean his mouth, food particles would lodge in the gaps. His breath became so foul that people standing near him would gag. Court officials learned to breathe through their mouths during audiences with the king. His skin broke out in severe acne and sores that wouldn't heal properly. His immune system, compromised by centuries of inbreeding, couldn't fight off the normal infections that accompany adolescence. Boils and abscesses appeared on his face and body. Court physicians lanced them repeatedly, but they kept coming back. His hair grew in patchy and thin. His body odor was overwhelming despite frequent baths. His fingernails grew twisted and thick. Every aspect of his physical development was wrong, corrupted by the genetic damage that permeated every cell. But worst were the seizures. Charles had experienced occasional seizures as a child, but in his teenage years they became frequent and severe. Grand mal seizures that would grip his body without warning, making him convulse violently for minutes at a time. Witnesses described it as horrifying. Charles would stiffen, his eyes rolling back. His already twisted body would contort further as muscles contracted uncontrollably. Foam and blood would pour from his mouth as he bit his tongue and cheeks. Sometimes he would lose control of his bladder and bowels during seizures, adding to the humiliation. The seizures could happen anywhere, anytime. During meals, during audiences with foreign ambassadors, during religious ceremonies. Servants learned to recognize the warning signs. A certain glassiness in his eyes, a sudden stillness, and would try to get him somewhere private before the seizure hit. They weren't always successful. After each seizure, Charles would be unconscious for hours, sometimes days. When he finally woke, he was even more impaired than before, more confused, less responsive, as if each seizure burned out a few more of his already limited brain cells. Court physicians tried every remedy they knew. They bled him. They gave him herbs. They tried to time treatments with astrological signs. Nothing reduced the frequency or severity of the seizures. Charles was trapped in a body that was actively trying to kill him over and over again. And through all of this, he was still the king. Official documents still required his signature. State business still nominally needed his approval. The entire machinery of empire still operated under the legal fiction that Charles II was making decisions. Queen Mariana, now in her 30s, was exhausted from managing both an empire and her impossible son. She'd aged dramatically. Contemporary portraits show a woman who looks 20 years older than her actual age. The stress had turned her hair grey, carved deep lines in her face, stolen any joy or lightness she might have once possessed. She loved Charles in her way. He was her son. She'd carried him, birthed him, cared for him his entire life. But she also resented him, resented what he represented, resented that her entire life had been consumed by this hopeless situation, resented that the dynasty she'd sacrificed everything to preserve was dying in front of her. Her relationship with Charles was complex and painful. She would sit with him for hours, talking to him, even though he couldn't respond. She would hold his hand during seizures. She would make sure he was comfortable, clean, cared for. But there was no real connection. How could there be? Charles barely seemed aware she existed. As Charles entered his late teens and early 20s, the succession crisis became impossible to ignore. He would never produce an heir. Everyone knew it, but saying it openly was still treasonous, so the court maintained its elaborate fiction. And that's when they decided Charles needed to get married. The search for a bride for Charles II was grotesque. Every royal family in Europe knew about Charles's condition by this point. The carefully maintained secrecy of his childhood had completely broken down. Ambassadors' reports, servants' gossip, and the occasional public appearance had spread the truth far and wide. So who marries a king that everyone knows is severely disabled, probably sterile, and unlikely to survive much longer? Someone politically desperate. France under Louis XIV saw an opportunity. A French princess married to the King of Spain could give France enormous influence over Spanish policy. The fact that the marriage would almost certainly be unconsummated didn't matter. The political alliance was what mattered. They selected Marie-Louise d'Orléans, 17 years old, the daughter of Louis XIV's brother. By all accounts, she was beautiful, lively, intelligent, everything Charles was not. The marriage negotiations are darkly fascinating to read in the archives. The French court tried to get information about exactly how disabled Charles was. The Spanish court tried to downplay his condition, while not outright lying in ways that could be proven false later. Spanish negotiators described Charles as delicate in health and shy in temperament. French negotiators pressed for specifics. Could he walk? Yes, with assistance. Could he speak? He has difficulty with formal speech but communicates his wishes. Could he fulfill his marital duties? The Spanish representatives became vague, talking about how such matters were private and how they were confident God would bless the union. Marie-Louise herself was told very little. Royal women of the era weren't generally consulted about their marriages anyway, but in this case, there seems to have been active deception. She was told the King of Spain had some health problems, but was improving, that he was perhaps socially awkward, but fundamentally capable, that she would be Queen of Spain, one of the most prestigious positions in Europe. What she wasn't told was that her future husband couldn't dress himself, couldn't eat solid food, and communicated primarily through grunts and moans. The wedding was arranged for 1679. Marie-Louise travelled from France to Spain, a journey of several weeks. Contemporary accounts describe her as excited, or at least resigned to doing her duty. She brought with her elaborate trousseau, dozens of dresses, jewellery, all the trappings of a royal bride. She had dreams, presumably, of what her life as Queen of Spain would be like. Those dreams died the moment she met Charles. The meeting was carefully choreographed. Marie-Louise was brought to a reception room in the palace. Charles was cleaned, dressed in his finest clothes, positioned carefully, in a chair with servants nearby to support him if needed. When Marie-Louise entered and saw him for the first time, witnesses reported that she stopped mid-step. Her smile froze. Her face went pale. She stood there, staring for several long seconds that must have felt like hours. Charles was 20 years old, but looked ancient. His jaw jutted out so far, his face looked almost inhuman. Drool ran from his open mouth down his elaborate collar. His eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing. His body was twisted in the chair, held in position by careful arrangement, rather than his own muscle control. Marie-Louise, to her credit, recovered her composure. She curtsied. She approached. She allowed Charles to take her hand, or rather, allowed a servant to place Charles's hand in hers. Charles made sounds, those wet, gurgling noises. Marie-Louise's smile wavered, but held. The meeting lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Charles couldn't maintain the appearance of normalcy any longer than that. He started becoming agitated, making louder noises. Servants quickly ushered him away, leaving Marie-Louise standing alone in the reception room. One of her ladies-in-waiting later reported that Marie-Louise stood silently for several minutes after Charles left. Then she asked very quietly, "That is the man I am to marry?" When told yes, Marie-Louise began crying. Not delicate tears, deep, racking sobs. She cried for over an hour. When she finally calmed enough to speak, she begged to be allowed to return to France, to cancel the wedding, to enter a convent, anything but this marriage. She was told that was impossible. The political alliance had been agreed upon. The wedding would proceed. Marie-Louise wrote desperate letters to her family in France. Some of these letters survived. She described Charles as the most physically repulsive and mentally deficient man I have ever encountered. She begged her uncle Louis XIV to intervene, to call off the marriage, to save her from this nightmare. Louis XIV's response was cold and political. The marriage must proceed. France needed the Spanish alliance. Marie-Louise must do her duty. Her personal feelings were irrelevant. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for November 1679. The Spanish court went into overdrive preparing, trying to make the event appear as normal as possible, despite the obvious impossibility of the situation. The ceremony itself was elaborate. The marriage of a king demands spectacle. The cathedral was decorated magnificently. Nobles from across Europe attended. Music played, incense burned. Everything was designed to create an atmosphere of celebration and legitimacy. Charles had to be literally carried into the cathedral, though they had tried to make it look like he was walking with support. He was positioned at the altar with servants on either side, ready to catch him if he started to fall. Marie-Louise entered looking beautiful in an elaborate white dress, and absolutely miserable. Every portrait of her from that day shows a woman whose smile doesn't reach her eyes. The ceremony required Charles to speak vows. This had been planned for months. The priest would say each vow slowly. Charles would make sounds. The priest would interpret these sounds as agreement. "Do you, Charles II, take Marie-Louise as your lawful wife?" Charles. Guttural noise. Priest. "He does." Marie-Louise had to speak her own vows clearly. Her voice cracked on the word, "I do." Some witnesses said she was crying. Others said she looked like she was going to be sick. When it came time for Charles to place the ring on her finger, a servant had to guide his hand. Charles's fingers were shaking. Whether from nerves or neurological issues, no one could tell. The ring was fumbled, dropped, retrieved, finally placed on Marie-Louise's finger with assistance. The kiss that traditionally sealed the marriage was, observers struggled to describe it. Charles's malformed mouth made kissing in any normal sense impossible. What happened was more like Marie-Louise's lips briefly touching the area near Charles's mouth while trying not to gag at the smell of his rotting teeth. And then they were married. The music swelled. Nobles applauded. Marie-Louise was now Queen of Spain, and she looked like she wanted to die. The wedding feast was torture. Marie-Louise sat next to her new husband at the head table, watching servants feed him liquid food while he drooled and made noises. She smiled. She made polite conversation with nobles who offered congratulations. She played her part perfectly, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her wine glass. Multiple witnesses commented on this. The new queen was terrified. The wedding night was something nobody wrote about explicitly, but we can piece together what happened from indirect references and Marie-Louise's later letters to her confessor. Charles was taken to the royal bedchamber and prepared for bed, which meant undressed and positioned in bed by servants. Marie-Louise arrived later, after her ladies-in-waiting had prepared her. What happened next, or rather, what didn't happen, became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Spanish court. Charles was almost certainly physically incapable of consummating the marriage. Later, medical examinations would reveal severe genital malformations. But beyond the physical impossibility, there was the psychological horror for Marie-Louise of being alone with this man who couldn't speak, couldn't move properly, who smelled of disease and decay. She emerged the next morning looking traumatized. Her eyes were red from crying. She moved stiffly, like someone in shock. Her ladies in waiting helped her dress in silence, not asking questions they didn't want answered. The court physicians examined her. Royal wedding nights were always followed by physician examinations to confirm consummation. Their reports were vague, using careful language that could be interpreted multiple ways. The marriage had been attempted. The Queen was intact but not injured. Make of that what you will. The official position was that the marriage had been consummated and the royal couple was now working on producing an heir. The reality was that Marie-Louise had just experienced the first night of what would be 10 years of psychological torture. Life as Charles's wife was unimaginably awful for Marie-Louise. She was queen in name, but her actual role was closer to a full-time caregiver for an adult-sized infant who happened to be king. Her days revolved around Charles's needs and schedule. She was expected to eat meals with him, sitting beside him while servants fed him, watching him drool and choke. She was expected to attend church services with him, standing beside him while he made noises during prayers. She was expected to sleep in the same apartments as him, though thankfully not always the same bed. The Spanish court was hostile to her. She was French, which automatically made her suspect. The Spanish nobility never fully accepted her. She was isolated, far from home, surrounded by people who viewed her as a foreign interloper. Her only job was to produce an heir. And everyone, including Marie-Louise, knew that was impossible. Court physicians examined her monthly, tracking her menstrual cycles, asking invasive questions about her interactions with Charles. They prescribed fertility treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful, special diets, herbal concoctions, prayers and religious rituals, all completely pointless because the problem wasn't with her fertility. They even suggested positions and timing for marital relations, as if Marie-Louise and Charles were having anything resembling normal sexual contact. The physicians would give detailed instructions about what Marie-Louise should do, instructions she couldn't possibly follow because Charles was incapable of participation. It was gaslighting on an institutional scale. The entire court pretended that Charles was capable of fathering children, and Marie-Louise was expected to maintain this fiction while knowing it was impossible. She grew increasingly desperate. Her letters to her confessor, some of which survived, described suicidal thoughts. She wrote about wanting to throw herself from the palace windows, about considering taking poison, about praying for death to release her from this nightmare. She wrote, "I am married to a monster, though he is not cruel, only incapable. He cannot speak to me, cannot touch me as a husband should, cannot even recognize me most days. I am more alone married than I ever was as a maiden. I am a virgin queen in all but name, and yet I am blamed for not producing heirs from a man who is barely alive." The Spanish climate didn't help. Marie-Louise was used to the temperate weather of France. Spain's extremes, scorching summers, freezing winters, made her constantly uncomfortable. She got sick frequently, though whether from actual illness or psychological stress is unclear. She had no friends. The Spanish court ladies either ignored her or actively undermined her. Her French attendants had been sent home shortly after the wedding. The Spanish court wanted to eliminate French influence. She was completely isolated. Her relationship with Charles was complicated. He wasn't cruel to her. He wasn't capable of cruelty or really any intentional behaviour. He just existed, needing constant care, unaware of her suffering or really of her existence as a person. Sometimes she felt pity for him. He was a victim too, trapped in his broken body through no fault of his own. Other times she felt rage at him, at the universe, at God for creating this situation. But mostly she felt emptiness, a vast hollow despair that nothing could fill. As years passed without an heir, the pressure on Marie-Louise intensified. Court physicians became more intrusive. Nobles made barely veiled accusations that she was failing in her duty. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments that the Spanish succession crisis was unresolved because the Queen was barren, the default assumption being that childlessness was always the woman's fault. Marie-Louise endured this for 10 years. 10 years of living with a man who couldn't have a conversation with her. 10 years of invasive medical examinations and accusations. 10 years of isolation in a hostile court in a foreign land. 10 years of watching her youth slip away while trapped in an impossible situation. And then in February 1689, she died suddenly. She was only 26 years old. The official cause was listed as appendicitis or possibly peritonitis, some kind of acute abdominal crisis that killed her within days of the onset of symptoms. But there were immediate whispers of foul play. Some suspected poison. Marie-Louise had made enemies at court, nobles who wanted Charles to remarry someone more politically advantageous, factions who saw her as an obstacle. The symptoms, sudden severe abdominal pain, vomiting, rapid decline, were consistent with certain poisons known at the time. Others suggested she might have poisoned herself, unable to face another day of her nightmare marriage. Her psychological state had been deteriorating. She'd written about wanting to die. Suicide seemed plausible to those who knew how desperate she'd become. Or it could have been exactly what the official reports said, a medical emergency that overwhelmed medieval medicine's ability to treat it. Appendicitis was often fatal in the 17th century. Peritonitis from a ruptured appendix or bowel obstruction could kill within days. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Marie-Louise died young, miserable, and childless after a decade of suffering in a marriage that should never have happened. Charles's reaction to his wife's death was minimal. He was told she had died. He made some sounds. It's unclear if he understood what death meant or if he even fully recognised who Marie-Louise had been. She'd been a presence in his life for 10 years, but whether he distinguished her from the servants who also cared for him daily is doubtful. The court went into official mourning. Black drapes were hung, masses were said. Marie-Louise was buried with royal honours. And then, barely 6 months later, the search for Charles's second wife began. Because Spain still needed an heir, and the fiction had to be maintained that Charles could provide one. The second wife's search was even more cynical than the first. Now everyone in Europe knew exactly what marrying Charles meant. The first marriage had failed to produce children. Most people attributed this to Charles's obvious incapacity, though officially it was blamed on Marie-Louise. So who would agree to marry Charles II now? Someone who needed the political alliance desperately enough to overlook everything. They found Mariana of Neuburg, German princess, daughter of the Elector Palatine. At 26 years old, she was past the prime marriage age for royalty. Her family saw the Spanish match as a tremendous opportunity, despite everything. The negotiations this time were brutally honest. The Spanish court couldn't hide Charles's condition anymore, so they admitted it openly. The king has severe health problems. He requires extensive care. The marriage may not be traditional, but she would be Queen of Spain. Mariana of Neuburg agreed. Maybe she thought it couldn't be as bad as described. Maybe she felt she had no better options. Maybe she was ambitious enough that wearing a crown mattered more than the cost. She arrived in Spain in 1690, and her wedding to Charles followed the same pattern as his first marriage. Elaborate ceremony. Charles positioned and managed through the rituals, vows spoken on his behalf, a new queen created through theatre and desperation. But Mariana was different from Marie-Louise. She was older, more pragmatic, less naive about what she was getting into. She approached her role as queen with a grim determination. She wouldn't love Charles, that was impossible, But she would fulfill her duties. She would care for him. She would manage the role of queen. She would try, however futilely, to produce an heir. Mariana threw herself into Charles's medical care with almost manic energy. She worked closely with court physicians, trying every possible treatment. They bled him regularly. They gave him increasingly elaborate herbal mixtures. They tried new diets. They brought in specialists from across Europe. They even attempted more extreme interventions. Exorcisms were performed regularly because some still believed Charles's condition might be supernatural. Priests would spend hours praying over him, sprinkling holy water, commanding demons to leave his body. Charles would just sit there, drooling, making his usual sounds, completely unaware of what was happening around him. Mariana also pushed for better record-keeping of Charles's symptoms and treatments. Her influence led to the detailed medical logs that still exist in Spanish archives. These documents are simultaneously valuable historical records and deeply disturbing accounts of one man's prolonged suffering. The logs describe Charles's daily life in excruciating detail: his seizures, their frequency, duration, and severity; his digestive problems, what he could eat, what made him vomit, how often he had diarrhea; his mental state, the rare moments of something resembling awareness versus the more common vacancy; his physical deterioration, the bed sores, the infections, the gradual weakening of his already minimal capacities. Reading these logs, you get a sense of Mariana as someone trying desperately to solve an unsolvable problem. She genuinely seemed to care about Charles's comfort and well-being, even as she recognized the hopelessness of his condition. But she also had political duties. She fought to maintain Spanish influence in European politics despite Charles's incapacity. She maneuvered against noble factions that wanted to marginalize her. She tried to position Spain advantageously for the inevitable succession crisis. Because the succession crisis was now the only thing that mattered. Charles wasn't going to recover. He wasn't going to produce an heir. The question facing Europe was, what happens when he dies? Charles's final decade was a slow-motion medical catastrophe. His 30s should have been his prime years, but instead they were a gradual disintegration of a body that had never worked properly to begin with. The seizures worsened. They came more frequently, sometimes multiple times per day. They lasted longer, sometimes over an hour, and they became more severe, leaving Charles unconscious for days afterward. Each seizure seemed to burn away a little more of his already limited cognitive function. His digestive system was failing. The difficulty swallowing that had always plagued him became severe enough that getting any nutrition into him was a daily battle. He vomited frequently. His body couldn't process the limited food he managed to consume. He was starving slowly, despite living in a palace with unlimited resources. His immune system, never strong, collapsed entirely. He was constantly sick with something. Respiratory infections that left him wheezing and struggling to breathe. Skin infections from the bed sores that covered his body. Urinary tract infections that caused agonizing pain. Infections in his mouth from his rotting teeth. The court physicians documented swelling in his abdomen and legs, likely organ failure causing fluid retention. His skin turned yellowish, probably liver disease. His urine was described as dark and foul-smelling. Kidney problems. His heartbeat was irregular and weak. Cardiac issues. He was dying. Had been dying his entire life, really, but now it was accelerating. And still, he lived. Year after year, his broken body clung to life with a tenacity that seemed almost cruel. Every time physicians thought the end was near, Charles would stabilize. His suffering would continue. By his late 30s, Charles spent most of his time in bed. He no longer had the strength to sit up, even with support. He lay in his royal apartments, surrounded by physicians and servants, existing in a twilight state between life and death. He couldn't communicate at all anymore. Not even the basic sounds and gestures that had served as his limited vocabulary before. He was completely unresponsive, his eyes open but unseeing, his mouth slack. Foreign ambassadors who managed to gain access to him during these final years wrote horrified accounts. One described Charles as looking more corpse than man, so wasted and still that only the occasional rise and fall of his chest proved he yet lived. The Spanish court existed in a state of anticipation, waiting for news of the king's death. European powers positioned themselves for the inevitable war over Spanish succession. Nobles manoeuvred for advantage in the post-Charles era. Everyone was planning for after, while Charles stubbornly refused to provide that after by simply continuing to breathe. The question of Charles's final will became critical. Who would inherit the Spanish Empire? The two main candidates were Philip of Anjou, a French Bourbon prince, and Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg from the Austrian branch of the family. Different court factions supported different candidates. The pro-French faction wanted Philip. The pro-Austrian faction wanted Archduke Charles. Both sides fought desperately to influence what would be written in Charles's name. Because Charles himself? Charles was in no condition to make such decisions. He was barely conscious most of the time. He couldn't understand explanations of European politics. He couldn't evaluate the pros and cons of different succession options. The will was written and rewritten multiple times as different factions gained temporary advantage. Each version claimed to represent Charles's wishes. All of them were pure fiction. In October 1700, Charles's condition deteriorated sharply. The physicians knew the end was finally approaching. His breathing became laboured and irregular. His pulse was weak and erratic. He slipped into a coma-like state. The final will was prepared in haste. Court officials argued over its contents, even as Charles lay dying. The version ultimately accepted named Philip of Anjou as heir, a decision that would reshape European politics for generations. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II of Spain finally died. He was 39 years old. He'd been king for 35 years. He'd never made a single independent decision or taken a single independent action. The death scene was witnessed by court officials who documented everything with meticulous detail, knowing this moment's legal and political significance. Charles had been unconscious for several days. His breathing had become so irregular that multiple times they thought he'd already died, only to have him gasp another breath. His body was bloated from fluid retention. His skin was yellow-grey. The smell in the room was reportedly unbearable, the smell of a body already beginning to decay. When he finally stopped breathing, there was almost relief in the room. Relief that his suffering was over. Relief that the dynastic nightmare was ending. Relief that Spain could maybe, possibly, begin to address the catastrophic succession crisis. But before Charles could be buried, an autopsy had to be performed. Royal autopsies were standard practice, but this one was particularly important. The physicians wanted to understand what had caused Charles's profound disabilities, and they needed official documentation of his physical condition for political and legal purposes. What they found shocked even hardened medical professionals. The autopsy report still exists in Spanish archives, and it's one of the most detailed medical documents from the era. The physicians who performed it wrote with unusual frankness, perhaps freed by Charles's death to finally tell the truth. They described opening Charles's body and finding a disaster. His intestines were described as putrefied and gangrenous, so diseased they were barely recognizable as organs. His stomach was described as having not a drop of liquid and being filled with ulcers and corrupted tissue. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, severely atrophied, barely functional. How it had kept him alive for 39 years was described as miraculous. His lungs were diseased and corrupted, likely from chronic infections and pneumonia. His liver was cirrhotic and barely functional. His kidneys showed severe disease. But the most revealing findings were in his genitals and brain. His testicles were described as completely atrophied. One surviving testicle was black as coal and non-functional. He was certainly sterile and possibly had never gone through normal puberty. The entire decade of trying to produce an heir had been even more pointless than anyone realized. And when they examined his head, opening his skull to look at his brain, they found severe underdevelopment. His brain was smaller than normal and partially liquefied, likely from repeated seizures and strokes throughout his life. The physical malformation, visible in his jaw, extended throughout his skull structure. His brain had never formed properly. The capacity for normal thought, normal function, normal human consciousness had never really been there. Charles had spent 39 years trapped in a body and brain that were fundamentally broken from conception. The autopsy physicians concluded their report with an observation that was equal parts medical assessment and philosophical statement. It is a miracle that he lived at all, and an even greater miracle that he lived so long. Charles was buried in the Escorial Palace, the massive royal complex built by his ancestor Philip II during Spain's Golden Age. The tomb was magnificent, marble and gold, elaborate carvings, fit for a king. The ceremony was beautiful, with all the pageantry Spain could muster. But there was something hollow about it. The Spanish court was already focused on what came next: the succession crisis, the wars that were about to start, survival in the new political reality. Charles himself, the actual person who had suffered and died, was almost forgotten in the chaos his death unleashed. The War of Spanish Succession began immediately and consumed Europe for 13 years. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the early 18th century. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. Civilian casualties were massive. Cities were destroyed. Economies were ruined. All because the Spanish Habsburgs had married their relatives until they literally couldn't produce viable heirs anymore. Spain lost the war, and with it, its empire. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 carved up Spanish territories. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria, Gibraltar went to Britain. Sicily and other Italian possessions were distributed among various powers. The Spanish throne went to Philip V, the Bourbon prince named in Charles's will. But Spain was now a second-rate power. The empire that had dominated half the world for 2 centuries was reduced to Spain itself and its increasingly restive American colonies. Those colonies would gain independence over the next century, breaking away from a mother country that no longer had the strength to hold them. By 1825, Spain had lost virtually all its American possessions. The Philippines, named after Philip II, remained Spanish until 1898, when the United States took them in the Spanish-American War, a conflict that demonstrated just how far Spain had fallen. All the European territories that had made Spain great were gone. All the wealth that had flowed from the Americas dried up. All the military might that had made Spanish armies feared was dissipated. The Spanish Empire died with Charles II. Not immediately. The death throes took a century. But the fatal blow came in 1700, when the last Habsburg king finally stopped breathing and the dynasty's genetic catastrophe was complete. Modern genetic analysis has revealed just how catastrophic the Habsburg inbreeding really was. Researchers have used the well-documented Habsburg family tree to calculate coefficients of inbreeding across generations. What they found was stunning. The Habsburgs had essentially conducted a 200-year experiment in how much genetic damage a family line could accumulate before collapsing entirely. Charles II's coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254, higher than what would result from a parent-child union. Only sibling-sibling reproduction over multiple generations would produce similar numbers. But it's not just Charles. The researchers found that Habsburg infant mortality increased dramatically with each generation. Early Habsburg children had relatively normal survival rates. By Charles II's generation, over 50% of children born to Habsburg parents died before age 10. The ones who survived often had severe health problems. The famous Habsburg jaw appeared with increasing frequency and severity. Cognitive impairments became more common. Physical disabilities increased. The family was literally dying out, killed by their own genetic choices. And they knew something was wrong. That's perhaps the most damning aspect. They watched their children get sicker. They saw the increasing infant mortality. They noticed the growing frequency of disabilities and deformities. And they kept marrying relatives anyway, because political considerations, keeping territories unified, preventing foreign dynasties from gaining claims, maintaining pure bloodlines, mattered more than the health of actual human beings. The really haunting comparison is to other European royal families. Yes, they also practiced inbreeding to some degree, but most of them married outside their immediate family, often enough to introduce fresh genetic material. The British royals married German princes and princesses. The French royals married across European dynasties. Most royal families had enough genetic diversity to avoid catastrophic outcomes. The Spanish Habsburgs took it to an extreme unmatched in European history. Uncle-niece marriages, first cousin marriages, generation after generation of the tightest possible inbreeding, until they created Charles II. Modern geneticists who study the Habsburg family tree use it as a case study in human inbreeding. It's referenced in genetics textbooks, used in university courses, cited in research papers about the dangers of reduced genetic diversity. The Habsburg dynasty has become a scientific cautionary tale. But beyond the science, there's the human tragedy. Charles II was a person, a human being who suffered every moment of his 39 years, who never asked to be born, who never had a chance at a normal life, who was condemned from conception to live in a body that didn't work. And he was just the last and most severe case. How many other Habsburg children suffered? The ones who died in infancy or childhood, experiencing brief, painful lives before their damaged bodies gave out. The ones who survived but lived with disabilities and health problems. The women who endured multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, their bodies trying to reject fetuses too genetically damaged to be viable. The human cost of the Habsburg genetic experiment is incalculable. Queen Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother, lived until 1696, long enough to watch her son struggle through his 30s, long enough to know the dynasty was doomed. Her final letters show a woman carrying tremendous guilt. She wrote to her confessor about her sins, about feeling responsible for Charles's condition, about the nightmare her life had become. She didn't understand genetics, that science didn't exist yet, but she understood that something in the Habsburg blood was poisoned, and she felt complicit in continuing it. She died exhausted, aged far beyond her years, having spent her life watching her son suffer without being able to help him. Mariana of Neuburg, Charles's second wife, remarried after his death and lived until 1740. She wrote in her later years about her time as Queen of Spain, describing it as 10 years in hell. She never had children, whether from trauma or choice we don't know, but she said once that watching Charles suffer had convinced her that some genetic lines should be allowed to die out, that forcing such marriages for political gain was a sin against nature, that she'd never wished Charles dead, but she'd wished he'd never been born for his own sake. The portraits of Charles II that hang in museums today tell the story visually. The early ones, painted in childhood, are heavily idealized, artists trying to hide the unhideable. As he ages, the portraits become more honest because hiding the truth became impossible. The final portraits, painted near the end of his life, show a man who looks ancient at 30-something. His face is distorted almost beyond recognition. His jaw juts out grotesquely. His eyes are vacant. His mouth hangs open. There's no spark of life or intelligence, just exhaustion. These paintings hang in the Prado in Madrid, in museums across Europe. When you see them in person, knowing the full story, they're devastating. Each painting is a chronicle of genetic deterioration, a visual representation of what happens when human ambition overrides biological reality. The Spanish Golden Age produced incredible art. Velázquez painted in Philip IV's court some of the greatest portraits in Western art history. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. The Escorial Palace, the Alhambra, the great cathedrals, all monuments to Spanish cultural achievement. But that same dynasty that created such beauty also created Charles II. The heights and the depths of human civilization, all in one family line. The lesson isn't subtle. The Habsburgs thought they could control their legacy through careful marriage planning. They thought keeping power concentrated in their bloodline would preserve their empire. They thought they knew better than nature. They were catastrophically wrong. Biology doesn't care about crowns or empires or royal bloodlines. The rules that govern genetic inheritance apply to everyone, kings and peasants alike. When you violate those rules, when you push against the fundamental requirements for genetic diversity and health, nature pushes back. And eventually, nature wins. Charles II was the physical manifestation of that lesson. Every painful moment of his 39 years was a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, even for empire. His life, if you can even call it that, was the cost of 2 centuries of royal hubris. The Spanish Empire fell not to military defeat or economic crisis or revolution. It fell because one family married their cousins and nieces and nephews for 200 years until they literally couldn't produce viable children anymore. It fell because they created Charles II, and by the time they realised what they'd done, it was too late to stop the collapse. The crown that Charles wore for 35 years sits in a museum now, behind glass, a relic of a dead empire and an extinct dynasty. A reminder of what happens when ambition and pride override basic human biology. And somewhere in the Escorial Palace, in an ornate tomb built for kings, lie the remains of Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, the cursed prince, the genetic endpoint, the living proof that you cannot cheat nature, no matter how many crowns you wear or how much power you wield. The story of Charles II is a warning that echoes across centuries, a reminder that beneath all the pageantry and claims of divine right, we're all biological beings, subject to the same fundamental rules. That nature is patient, but ultimately unforgiving. That you can build the greatest empire in the world, but if you violate the basic principles of genetic health, everything you've built will crumble. The Spanish Habsburgs learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. They learned it too late, and Charles II paid the price for lessons his ancestors should have learned generations earlier. His story remains a permanent reminder, not just of royal excess or dynastic failure, but of the fundamental truth that some laws, the laws of nature, of biology, of life itself, cannot be broken without consequences. Charles II of Spain, the cursed king, the genetic catastrophe, the empire's doom, born November 6th, 1661, died November 1st, 1700. He lived 39 years, ruled 35, and never had a single day of peace. And in his suffering, in his broken body, in his vacant eyes, he taught the world a lesson it should never forget. Some mistakes echo through generations, some sins are written in blood, and some warnings come too late to save anyone. The Spanish Empire learned that warning carved into the bones of one small broken child, a warning that still whispers from those old portraits, from that ornate tomb, from the ruins of an empire that destroyed itself from within. A warning written in the twisted jaw, the vacant eyes, the drooling mouth of the last Habsburg king of Spain. Nature always collects its debts, always, and the price is always higher than you think you can pay.